The universe operates on principles we understand. Physics, chemistry, the fundamental laws of cause and effect. But sometimes those laws bend. Sometimes a man who has already been lost to time finds himself lost again, dropped into a world that makes even the horrors of World War II look straightforward. Steve Rogers had survived the ice. He had survived Thanos. He had survived 100 battles that should have broken him. But nothing, not one moment in his long, strange life, had prepared him for the smell of Westeros. He came to consciousness face down in mud. The air hit him first. Wood smoke, animal dung, something rotting nearby, and beneath it all, the green, living smell of a forest untouched by industry. No exhaust fumes, no electrical hum, just wind through leaves and the distant sound of a river moving fast over rocks. Steve pushed himself upright, his body already cataloging injuries with the practiced efficiency of a man whose nervous system had been remade in a laboratory. Nothing broken, some bruising along his left side. The shield was still strapped to his back. He felt its familiar weight like an old friend. He was in a clearing at the edge of a tree line. Behind him, the forest stretched dark and dense. Ahead, a rutted road of churned earth wound between low hills, and on that road, the wreckage of a cart lay on its side, grain spilling into the mud. Two bodies beside it, small folk from the look of their rough-spun clothes. A man and a woman, neither armed, neither alive. Steve crouched beside them. The wounds were sword cuts, efficient, unhurried. Whoever had done this hadn't been in a fight. They'd been making a point. He stood, scanning the tree line, and heard them before he saw them. 4 horsemen coming back along the road from the east, cloaks the color of dried blood, a golden lion stitched on the breast of each. They were laughing. One of them had a chicken tied to his saddle, still living, wings beating uselessly. They hadn't expected anyone to be standing in the road when they came back around the bend. They stopped laughing. "Another one," said the lead rider, a broad man with a broken nose, and the easy cruelty of someone who had never faced real consequences. He looked Steve over. The strange blue suit, the round shield, the expression on Steve's face, and misread all of it. Brave small folk these days, or stupid. He glanced at his companions. "Same thing, I suppose." "You killed these people," Steve said. It wasn't a question. "Ahina, they were slow paying their lord's taxes." The rider shrugged. "Lesson for the next village." Steve had been in enough wars to know that some situations didn't benefit from extended conversation. He also knew that 4 mounted soldiers in full armor represented a genuine tactical problem, even for him. But he'd faced worse before breakfast on better days than this. "Get down off your horses," he said. "All of you." The broken-nosed rider stared at him for a long moment, then drew his sword. What followed was brief and efficient. Steve took the first rider off his horse with a throw of the shield that caught the man across the collarbone. The vibranium rang against the soldier's armor, with a sound like a bell, and the man dropped. The second rider spurred forward and caught a spinning return of the shield directly to his horse's flank. However, the animal reared, throwing its rider into the mud. The third tried to flank left and found Steve already there, moving with a speed that made the warhorse flinch sideways. Steve caught the man's sword arm, redirected the thrust, and brought the rider down with a controlled takedown that left him winded but breathing. The fourth ran. Steve let him go. He always let one go. Not out of mercy, though mercy was part of it, but because someone needed to carry the story back. In his experience, the story did half the work. He stood in the road, breathing steadily, the shield back on his arm, and looked at the 3 groaning men in the mud. None were dead. He hadn't intended any of them to be. "Who commands your force?" he asked the broken-nosed man. Who was clutching his collarbone and staring up at Steve with an expression caught somewhere between fury and genuine fear. "Lord Tywin Lannister commands the West," the man wheezed. "You've just made an enemy of the most powerful man in the 7 kingdoms, you mad bastard." Steve had heard that kind of line before. Different names, same threat. He knelt and checked the man's injury. Painful, possibly cracked, not life-threatening. Then stood. "Tell your lord that what happened here today was wrong," Steve said. "Killing unarmed civilians isn't taxation. It's murder. If he wants to have a conversation about that, I'm not hard to find." He left them in the road and walked toward the nearest sign of civilization, a smear of chimney smoke above the next hill that suggested a village. If he was going to figure out where and when he needed information. He needed someone willing to talk. What he found, half a mile on, was a village of maybe 40 souls in various states of fear, their food stores recently raided, their able-bodied men hiding in the woods. A girl of perhaps 12 came to the door of the nearest cottage and stared at him with the flat, assessing gaze of a child who had learned early that strangers usually meant trouble. "I'm not going to hurt anyone," Steve said, which was what he always said and which he always meant. She studied his shield. "Are you a knight?" Steve thought about that for a moment. In a sense, he supposed he was, just not the kind this world had produced. "Something like that," he said. "What's your name?" "Mira. Mira." He crouched to her eye level. "Why, can you tell me where we are? What region this is?" She looked at him like he'd asked what color the sky was. "The Riverlands," she said. "Everyone knows that." He didn't know that. He didn't know much of anything yet. But Steve Rogers had started from nothing before, a skinny kid from Brooklyn with no advantages and no allies. And he had learned that the best thing to do when you're lost is to find the people who need help most and start there. The Riverlands. Whatever that meant, it was home now. At least for a while. If you want to see more crossover stories like this one, hit that subscribe button and drop a character you'd love to see thrown into an impossible world in the comments below. The village of Sherrick's Mill had seen better decades. The mill itself still turned on the river, a small mercy, but the granary had been stripped twice in the past year, once by Lannister soldiers and once by a band that claimed to ride for Robb Stark, but behaved like no soldier any honorable lord would recognize. The distinction, one weathered elder named Pole explained to Steve over a bowl of thin barley soup, had stopped mattering to the people who actually lived here. Soldiers were soldiers. They came, they took, they left. The color of the cloak was just decoration. Steve listened more than he spoke. It was a habit that had served him well since the 40s. Let people talk, absorb the geography of a situation before you start drawing lines on maps. Within an hour, he had a working picture of where he was and what was happening around him. A war, multiple claimants to a throne, a kingdom fracturing along every seam it possessed. The names were unfamiliar, but the dynamics were not. He'd seen this before. Power vacuums filled with violence. Ordinary people caught in the machinery of other men's ambitions. What he hadn't expected was the scale of casual brutality. In every war he'd fought, atrocity had been the exception that command tried, sometimes hypocritically, sometimes genuinely, to prevent. Here it seemed to be standard operating procedure. The strong took from the weak because the strong could. There was no Geneva Convention. There was no oversight. There was appetite and there was fear, and there was the sword. He helped the village bury the two people from the road. A husband and wife named Aldrich and Sept of Baelor, the girl's parents, as it turned out, or though she told him this with a dry-eyed steadiness that broke something in him quietly. She had already grieved, or she was saving it. Either way, she helped carry the rocks for the cairn without being asked. He was still at the graveside when the Brotherhood found him. They came out of the forest at dusk. 8 riders, none in matching armor, all of it mismatched and road-worn, flying a banner he didn't recognize, a flaming sword on black. They were competent. He could see that immediately. They moved with the practiced coordination of people who had survived long enough to learn. The man who rode at their head had died before, which Steve didn't know yet, but could somehow sense in the way the man held himself, like someone who had already paid the worst price the world could charge and found it hadn't stuck. "Yes, word travels fast in the Riverlands," the man said. His voice was dry, unhurried, a long scar running down the left side of his face like a river on a map. "A man in strange armor who fights like a demon and leaves Lannister soldiers breathing when he could have killed them. That's either a fool or someone we want to know." "Which do you think?" Steve asked. The scarred man smiled, a thin, thoughtful expression. "I haven't decided. I'm Beric Dondarrion, Lord of Blackhaven. These are my companions." He gestured loosely at the riders behind him, who watched Steve with the careful attention of people who had learned to take nothing for granted. "And you, stranger?" You have the look of no land I've ever ridden through. Steve Rogers. He paused because the follow-up explanation was going to be difficult under the best circumstances. When I'm from a long way away, further than you'd believe. Try me, Beric said. I've been resurrected from the dead 6 times. My threshold for belief is considerable. Steve looked at him carefully, decided the man was telling the truth, and filed that information in the part of his mind where he kept things that required further investigation. I'm not from this world, he said. Not from this time. I don't know exactly how I got here or how to get back. What I do know is that I watched Lannister soldiers murder 2 unarmed civilians on that road this afternoon, and I'm not the kind of person who walks past that. Silence. The Brotherhood exchanged glances, not skeptical exactly, more the look of people recalibrating. A woman near the back of the group, red-haired and sharp-eyed, leaned forward in her saddle. He took 4 Lannister men off their horses without a scratch, she said to Beric. I had 3 of my people watching from the trees. He moved like... She paused, searching for the word. Like nobody I've ever seen. And that shield. Beric looked at the vibranium disc. Even in the dim evening light, it caught what remained of the sunset with an odd clean gleam that seemed wrong somehow. Too perfect, too unblemished for a world this dirty. What is it made of? He asked. Something that doesn't exist here, Steve said honestly. It doesn't dent, doesn't scratch. I've had it a long time. Beric nodded slowly, the way a man nods when he's storing information rather than accepting it. Thoros, he called, and the other man, stocky, shaved head, with the remnants of a red priest's robes worn down to something unrecognizable, nudged his horse forward and studied Steve with unsettling directness. The Lord of Light sends strange instruments, Thoros said, half to himself, then louder. You're not touched by the flame, but there's something on you, something that doesn't belong to this world. He looked at Beric. He's telling the truth about that much. I generally do, Steve said. Beric swung down from his horse, which Steve took as a good sign. You didn't dismount in front of a threat unless you were either very confident or making a gesture of trust, and the scarred lord didn't strike him as reckless. He walked to the cairn Steve had built, looked at it for a moment, then back at Steve. The Brotherhood without banners fights for the small folk, he said. No king, no lord. And we ride for the people the great houses have forgotten. It's inglorious work, poor pay, high mortality in the conventional sense. A faint wry note in his voice acknowledged the irony. But it's the only war being fought in this country that I believe in anymore. Steve looked at the cairn, at Mira, who had returned to the cottage doorway and was watching with the silent attention of a child trying to determine whether the adults were going to make things better or worse. Then we want the same thing, Steve said. Beric extended his hand, a gesture that crossed any cultural divide because it was human and old and universal. Steve shook it. Can you ride? Beric asked. I've managed. Good, because there's a village 2 days east being bled dry by a Frey bannerman, and we're short on men who can do what you apparently did this afternoon. He glanced at the shield one more time. Whatever you are, Rogers, this war can use you. Steve thought of Aldrich and his wife. He thought of Mira's dry eyes at the graveside. Lead the way, he said. 2 days riding with the Brotherhood without banners taught Steve several things. First, that a medieval warhorse was nothing like the motorcycles he preferred, but his enhanced physiology made the adjustment faster than it should have been. By the second morning, he was comfortable enough in the saddle that the Ross stopped watching him with that particular expression of a man waiting for someone to fall off something embarrassing. Second, that the Riverlands in wartime was a landscape of controlled devastation, burned farmsteads, abandoned villages, fields left unharvested because the people who planted them had either fled or died. Third, and most importantly, that Beric Dondarrion was one of the most genuinely decent men Steve had encountered in any century. And that decency in this world came at a cost that would have broken someone less committed to paying it. They rode through a forest corridor that the Brotherhood used as a regular route, sheltered from the main roads where Lannister outriders patrolled. Ongai, the group's archer, young, freckled, with a boredom in his eyes that concealed exceptional skill, rode beside Steve for most of the second day and answered questions with the straightforward patience of someone who had explained the basics of Westerosi politics to confused strangers before, though never quite this confused. Amber, so there's no central authority, Steve said. No governing body that all the lords answer to. There's the king. Who's a boy, controlled by his mother's family. Aye, and the family controlling him is at war with roughly half the continent. Give or take. Steve processed this. And the common people, the small folk, they have no representation in any of this. No voice in who rules them. Angie looked at him with genuine bewilderment, the way Steve had learned people looked at him when he said something that was obvious common sense in his world and apparently radical philosophy in theirs. They're small folk, Angie said, as if that settled it. It didn't settle it for Steve. It never would. The village of Crossmill was in worse shape than Sherrick's Mill had been. They smelled it before they saw it. The specific, stomach-turning combination of ash and something organic that Steve recognized from bombed-out European towns in 1944. But when they crested the hill and looked down at the cluster of buildings beside the river crossing, he was relieved to see the structures still standing. The smell was from the fields. Someone had burned the crops rather than let the villagers harvest them. A Frey bannerman named Sir Harwin Holt had established himself in the village's largest building, the mill owner's house, 2 stories of timber and plaster, with 12 soldiers and an attitude of permanent entitlement. He was collecting a road tax on the river crossing, a grain tax on whatever the villagers had managed to salvage, and what Beric described with careful neutrality as an additional tax for the privilege of not being burned along with the fields. The Brotherhood's approach was direct. Beric would ride in openly, invoking the king's justice, and give Holt the opportunity to stand down. Steve had already identified this as optimistic, but understood the principle. You offered the off-ramp before you took the bridge by force. What changed the calculation was the information Beric's scout brought back 20 minutes before they rode in. Holt had taken 3 village men as hostages, held inside the mill house specifically against the possibility of Brotherhood interference. Steve modified the plan accordingly. While Beric rode through the village gate with 5 riders in a display of deliberate, attention-commanding visibility, Steve went over the back wall of the mill house compound alone. The shield went on his back. He moved through the shadows beside the building with the particular stillness that the super soldier serum had given him. Not invisibility, but something close to it. The ability to occupy space without announcing himself. To find the rhythm of a location and move inside it rather than against it. 2 guards on the rear door. He took them quickly and quietly, one after the other, using takedowns that left both men unconscious and breathing. Inside, a narrow staircase led up to a storage room where 3 village men sat bound and gagged, their faces showing the particular exhaustion of people who had given up on rescue. He had them ungagged and partially untied when he heard Beric's voice rising in the courtyard below. The controlled, formal cadence of a man making a legal case to someone who had no interest in the law. Holt's response was shorter and considerably less formal. Steve helped the last man to his feet. "Can you walk?" The man, middle-aged, hands roughened by mill work, a black eye that was 2 days old, stared at Steve's suit, his shield, his face. "What are you?" "Someone passing through," Steve said. "Is there a back way out of this building?" There was. A hatch in the floor of the storage room that opened onto a root cellar, which opened in turn onto a drainage ditch behind the compound wall. Steve got all 3 men out and moving toward the tree line before the situation in the courtyard deteriorated past the point of Beric's considerable patience, which it did approximately 90 seconds later, when Sir Harwin Holt decided that a scarred outlaw lord with a flaming sword was less frightening than the political consequences of backing down in front of his own men. The fighting in the courtyard was brief. The Brotherhood were better soldiers than Holt's garrison, leaner, more motivated, unencumbered by the complacency that came with easy work against unarmed farmers. Steve came back over the wall in time to deal with the 3 soldiers who had broken for the gate, which he did efficiently and without ceremony. When it was over, Holt was alive, sitting in the mud with his hands bound, surrounded by Brotherhood members, and his 12 soldiers were in various states of incapacitation, but none of them dead. Holt looked at Steve with the specific fury of a man who had been beaten by something he couldn't categorize. "What in the 7 hells are you?" Somebody who grew up getting beaten up by bullies, Steve said, and never developed much sympathy for them. Barrack appeared at his shoulder, flaming sword extinguished, looking at the three freed hostages emerging from the tree line. Something shifted in his expression. Satisfaction, maybe, or the particular peace of a man who still believed in what he was doing, despite every reason the world had given him to stop. "You cleared the house yourself," Barrack said quietly. It wasn't accusatory. It was the tone of a man updating his assessment. "Hostages changed the math," Steve said. Barrack nodded. He was quiet for a moment, watching his people tend to the villagers. Food distributed from Brotherhood packs, injuries assessed. Watch the practical machinery of people who did this regularly and had learned what mattered in the aftermath. Then, "Word of what you did at Sherrick's Mill has already moved faster than we rode. There are people in King's Landing who will hear about you within the fortnight." Steve had anticipated this. "Varys?" he asked, because Ongai had mentioned the name twice in the context of information that seemed to travel impossibly fast. Barrack glanced at him sideways. "You learn quickly." "I've dealt with intelligence agencies before," Steve said. It came out more tired than he intended. Above them, the first stars were appearing over the Riverlands in a sky unpolluted by anything but wood smoke. Steve looked at them for a moment. Different constellations, different sky, same darkness between the lights, and felt the familiar weight of being exactly where he was needed and exactly nowhere he recognized. He'd been here before. He knew what to do with it. The Raven arrived at Winterfell before Steve did, which meant that Ned Stark had already formed an opinion before the two men ever stood in the same room. It hadn't been Steve's intention to go north. The Brotherhood's work was in the Riverlands, and there was enough of it to occupy a dozen men with his capabilities for a decade. But 3 weeks after Crossmill, a rider came into the Brotherhood's forest camp, carrying a personal message from the Warden of the North. Not a command, not a summons, but an invitation written in the careful, deliberate hand of a man who chose every word with the awareness that words had consequences. Barrack had read it twice, handed it to Steve without comment, and waited. "I have heard of the man called Rogers. I have heard what he fights for and how he fights. I would speak with him if he is willing. The North remembers those who protect the innocent." "Eddard Stark, Lord of Winterfell." Steve had looked at it for a long moment. Then, "Tell me about him." What the Brotherhood told him about Ned Stark took the better part of an evening and left Steve with the uncomfortable sensation of hearing about himself described by someone else. A man of absolute honor in a world that punished honor. A man who believed in truth when everyone around him had learned to deal in comfortable lies. A man raising children to be decent in a kingdom that would eventually require them to be ruthless. "He's going to get himself killed," Thoros said, not unkindly. She's staring into the fire. "Probably," Barrack agreed. Steve had gone north. Winterfell was nothing like he expected and exactly what he should have anticipated. A fortress built by people who understood that winter was not a season, but a geological event, designed not for beauty, but for survival. Every stone and wall and tower arranged around the central truth that the cold would come, and you had better be ready for it. The hot springs that ran beneath the castle kept it warmer than it had any right to be, and steam rose from grates in the courtyard in the early morning like the castle itself was breathing. Ned Stark met him in the yard, not the Great Hall. That told Steve something immediately. The yard was where you met a soldier, an equal, someone you intended to speak to honestly rather than impress. Stark was taller than Steve had imagined, with the weathered, economical physicality of a man who had spent his life doing actual work rather than ordering others to do it. He had gray eyes that assessed without performing assessment, and when he looked at Steve's shield, he didn't reach for it or ask to examine it. He just noted it and moved on. "Lord Stark," Steve said. "I'm told you don't use titles yourself," Ned replied, "so I'll ask you to drop mine. Walk with me." They walked the walls of Winterfell in the early morning cold while the castle woke around them. Servants crossing the yard below, the sound of training swords from the practice area, where a young red-haired girl was attempting a water dancing form with more enthusiasm than technique, so supervised by a slight man with a Bravosi accent who was pretending not to be impressed. Steve noted the girl, made a file for her. Children who trained that hard that young were usually running towards something or away from it. And in his experience, both motivations produced remarkable people. You've been in the Riverlands 3 weeks, Ned said. It wasn't a question. In that time, you've disrupted 4 Lannister foraging operations, freed hostages on 2 occasions, and apparently convinced Beric Dondarrion, who is not a man easily convinced of anything, that you are genuinely from another world. He paused. Are you? Yes, Steve said. Can you prove it? The shield, Steve said. Have your master examine it. He won't be able to identify the material or explain why it behaves the way it does. Ned considered this with the patience of a man who had learned that the universe occasionally produced things that didn't fit existing categories and that the correct response was careful attention rather than denial. I'll take your word for it, he said, which surprised Steve. Most people want the proof first. Most people are afraid the proof will complicate their understanding of the world, Ned said. I found that complicated understanding is generally more accurate than simple understanding. He stopped walking, looking out over the gray expanse of the Wolfswood beyond Winterfell's walls. I wanted to meet you because of what you didn't do. Steve waited. You had 4 Lannister soldiers helpless. 3 of them had just committed murder. You left them alive and delivered a message. Ned turned to look at him directly. Every sellsword, every hedge knight, every man of violence I have ever known would have killed them. It's cleaner. It's safer. It removes witnesses. He paused. Why didn't you? Because killing them wouldn't have changed anything, Steve said. It would have just been killing, leaving them alive with a message. That has a chance of changing something. Small chance, but a chance. Ned was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice had shifted slightly. Not softer exactly, but more careful, the way a man's voice changes when he's saying something true that he doesn't say often. I have believed something like that my entire life, he said, and I have watched this world punish that belief consistently without mercy. I know, Steve said. Oh, I've lived it too. Different world, same lesson. Then why do you keep believing it? Steve looked out at the Wolfswood. Somewhere in his chest, the answer was old and worn smooth from use, like a stone carried a long distance. Because the alternative is becoming the thing you're fighting, he said. And I've seen what that looks like. It doesn't win. It just makes everything worse. Ned Stark looked at him for a long time with those gray, assessing eyes. Then he nodded once, the nod of a man who has found something he was afraid no longer existed. My wife will want to meet you, he said. She'll be suspicious and direct, and she'll ask questions that are more strategic than they sound. Answer them honestly. Well, she respects honesty even when she disagrees with the conclusion. And your children. Something moved across Ned's face. Love and worry occupying the same expression simultaneously, which Steve recognized from every parent he'd ever known in wartime. My son Rob is 17 and absorbing everything. Be careful what you model for him. He paused. He's going to be a lord, possibly soon. He needs to understand that honor and strategy are not mutually exclusive, but I'm not sure I've taught that well enough. They stood together in the cold morning air, 2 men from entirely different worlds who had somehow arrived at the same place philosophically and were now watching the same horizon with the same specific dread of someone who can see what's coming and isn't sure anyone else can. You know it's going to get worse, Steve said quietly. The war. Whatever's underneath the war. Yes, Ned said, and you're going to do the right thing anyway. I'm going to try. Ned's voice was steady, without self-pity. It's the only thing I know how to do. Steve nodded. He understood that completely. He understood it in his bones, in the serum-enhanced marrow of every bone the government had rebuilt for him in a laboratory in 1943, in every choice he'd made since that had cost him something he couldn't get back. Then we'll try together, Steve said, while I'm here. It was the most he could promise. In this world, it turned out, it was enough to matter. The invitation to King's Landing arrived 11 days after Steve left Winterfell, which meant it had been written before he got there. Someone in the capital had been tracking him with a precision that suggested resources, patience, and a very specific interest in anomalies that didn't fit existing categories. The letter bore no seal he recognized. The handwriting was elegant and unhurried. The prose constructed with the careful architecture of someone who had learned that the most dangerous sentences were the ones that sounded harmless. It was addressed not to the stranger or the foreign knight, but to Steve Rogers, which meant whoever wrote it had sources inside the Brotherhood and possibly inside Winterfell itself. It was signed, "A friend who prefers gardens to thrones." Beric had looked at it with the expression of a man handling something that might bite. "Varys," he said, "the spider, master of whisperers on the small council." He set the letter down carefully. "He knows things he shouldn't know. He moves pieces on a board nobody else can fully see. And he has never, in my experience, done anything without a reason that runs 3 moves deeper than whatever reason he gives you." "Sounds like someone I used to work for, Imena," Steve said, thinking of Fury, which was not entirely a compliment. "Will you go?" Steve had already decided. Information was power in any world, and the most dangerous thing he could do in this one was remain ignorant of the larger architecture. The Brotherhood's work was essential. Village by village, crossing by crossing, the grinding human work of protecting people the great houses had abandoned. But it was reactive. To understand what he was actually inside, he needed to see the center. He rode to King's Landing alone, Maorne, which Beric had argued against, and Steve had overruled on the grounds that a large group announced itself, and he was better in difficult situations without people he cared about to protect. He left the shield visible on his back, because concealing it was pointless. Everyone who mattered already knew about it, and rode through the King's Road's increasing traffic as the capital's gravity pulled more people toward it, merchants and pilgrims and refugees and soldiers, all funneling toward the same point. King's Landing hit him like a physical force. He'd been in crowded cities before. New York in the 40s, modern New York, cities across Europe during the war. But nothing had prepared him for the medieval capital's particular assault on every sense simultaneously. The population was enormous for its infrastructure, compact into streets that hadn't been designed for this many people. The smell alone, a layered complexity of salt air and fish market and tannery, and the specific sweetness of decay that large concentrations of humanity produced before modern sanitation. The Red Keep rose above it all on its hill like a clenched fist, its towers catching the afternoon light, beautiful and brutal in equal measure. Varys met him not at the castle, but at a bathhouse near the Street of Silk. Neutral ground, Steve recognized, a location chosen to communicate that this conversation was unofficial. The eunuch was exactly as Engi had described him. Soft-looking in the way that very capable people sometimes cultivated deliberately, with pale hands and a shaved head and small eyes that missed absolutely nothing. He was dressed plainly, which Steve suspected was a choice rather than a limitation. "Sir Rogers," Varys said, settling across from him in a private room that smelled of cedar and clean water. "Though I understand you prefer no title." "Just Steve. Just Steve." Varys smiled. A real smile, Steve thought, or at least a very good approximation of one. A man without a title in a city built entirely on titles. How refreshingly honest. "You know where I'm from," Steve said. Not a question. "I know you are not from this world," Varys said carefully. "The specifics remain beyond my little bird's reach, which I find genuinely extraordinary. There is very little beyond their reach." He tilted his head slightly. "You have been in the Riverlands for a month. Whilst you have protected perhaps 200 smallfolk directly and demonstrated capabilities that no existing military force in the Seven Kingdoms can match, you have allied yourself with a dead man who fights for a dead king's justice, and you spent a week in Winterfell with a man whose honor is going to get him killed within the year." The last part landed like a stone in still water. Steve kept his face neutral. "You know about Ned. I know about everyone." Varys's voice carried no satisfaction, only the faint exhaustion of someone who had held too much information for too long. "Lord Stark is going to come to King's Landing. He is going to discover things that cannot be undiscovered. And his response to those things will be honest and principled and catastrophically dangerous to himself." He paused. "Aronide, I tell you this not to alarm you, but because I believe you may be the only person in this city capable of preventing what comes next." Steve studied him. "Why do you care? You work for the crown." "I work for the realm," Varys said with a precision that suggested the distinction was the most important thing he'd said. The crown is a piece of metal. The realm is 8 million people who mostly want to plant their crops and raise their children without being conscripted or burned or taxed into starvation. They are not the same thing, and I have spent 30 years ensuring they are not confused for each other. He folded his hands in his lap. You fight for the small folk. So do I in my way. Our methods differ considerably. That's one way to put it, Steve said. Oh, you disapprove of deception. Generally. And yet you understand it, Varys said. You've operated in environments where information was weaponized, where the truth was managed rather than shared. I can see it in how you listen. You're not just hearing my words, you're mapping my incentives. He smiled again, smaller this time. You would have made an extraordinary spy master. I'll take that as a warning, Steve said. Varys acknowledged this with a slight incline of his head. There is a second player you should know about, he said. Where I operate from genuine concern for the realm's stability, Lord Baelish operates from, he paused, choosing the word with surgical care, hunger. When he wants specific things and he is extraordinarily talented at positioning others to pay the price of getting them for him. His voice dropped slightly. He is also aware of you. He will make contact. He will present himself as an ally. He will find whatever you value most and offer it to you. Steve thought of Ned Stark's gray eyes, of Mira at the graveside, of the systematic, patient work of 200 small folk protected one village at a time. What does he think I value most? Steve asked. A way home, Varys said simply. The room was very quiet for a moment. Outside, King's Landing moved and breathed and stank, indifferent to the conversation happening inside it. Steve had not let himself think about home with any frequency, because thinking about it too much in the middle of a war was a luxury that got people killed. But the word landed in him now with unexpected weight. Brooklyn, Sam's voice, the specific quality of light over the Potomac on a winter morning, and he felt the shape of it like a bruise he'd forgotten was there. Can he actually deliver that? Steve asked. No, Varys said, but he will make you believe he can for exactly as long as it serves his purposes. He leaned forward slightly. I tell you this because a man pursuing a false hope is a man who can be steered. And I would rather you be steered by accurate information than by Peter Baelish's particular brand of creative fiction. Steve nodded slowly. He stood, and Varys stood with him, and for a moment they regarded each other across the cedar-scented room with the mutual respect of people who had chosen very different tools for the same essential work. One more thing, Varys said. The Queen's eyes are already on you. Cersei Lannister does not leave anomalies unaddressed. She will move to either use you or eliminate you, and she will do it soon. He paused. She is more dangerous than most people account for, because most people make the mistake of underestimating her intelligence while overestimating her patience. I'll keep that in mind, Steve said. Please do, Varys said. The realm can afford to lose many things. It cannot currently afford to lose you. Steve left the bathhouse into the noise and press of King's Landing, the Red Keep watching from its hill, and felt the distinct sensation of a net being drawn around him from multiple directions simultaneously. He'd felt it before, in Hydra facilities in Siberia, in conference rooms that looked like conference rooms but functioned as traps. The difference was that here, he didn't have backup. The difference was that here, the people he was trying to protect numbered in the millions, and the people trying to use him had been playing this game since before he was born. He pulled his cloak tighter against the sea wind and walked toward the Red Keep. If Cersei Lannister was going to make a move, he'd rather it happened on ground he'd chosen. The Red Keep's throne room was designed to intimidate, and Steve could appreciate the craft of it even while refusing to be intimidated. The Iron Throne itself was the centerpiece of the effect, a massive, ugly monument to conquest, forged from the swords of defeated enemies, its edges still sharp enough to draw blood from anyone who sat carelessly. Sir Aegon the Conqueror had built it that way deliberately, the story went, because a king who sat too comfortably stopped paying attention. Steve looked at it for a long moment when he was brought in, and thought that it was the most honest piece of political architecture he'd ever seen. It told you exactly what kind of power it represented. Cersei Lannister was not sitting on the throne. She was standing beside it, which was a more sophisticated choice, close enough to its authority to invoke it, free enough from it to move. She was dressed in Lannister crimson, Her gold hair arranged with the precision of someone who understood that appearance was the first argument you made before you'd said a word. She was, Steve noted, genuinely striking, and she knew it. And she used it as a tool with the same unsentimental efficiency that he used the shield. Beside her, on the throne's steps, sat Joffrey. Steve had been briefed on Joffrey by three separate sources: Varys obliquely, Angie bluntly, and a stable hand outside the keep who had offered an unprompted and remarkably detailed character assessment that aligned with the other two. He had formed a picture. The reality was worse than the picture, because pictures couldn't capture the quality of the boy's attention. The way his eyes moved over Steve, not with curiosity, but with the evaluative hunger of someone determining what something was worth and how it could be used or broken. He was 16 years old, and he had the eyes of someone who had never been told no by anything that mattered. "Steve Rogers," Cersei said. Her voice was controlled, hatch warm on the surface with something considerably cooler underneath. "The Mystery Knight of the Riverlands. We've heard remarkable things." "Your Grace," Steve said, addressing her with the courtesy title, because it cost him nothing and bought him information about how she responded to it. She received it smoothly, which meant she was accustomed to it and not dependent on it. A woman who would be equally dangerous with or without the title. "Kneel," Joffrey said. Steve looked at him with the specific patience he reserved for people who had confused volume for authority. "I kneel for very few things," he said pleasantly. "I'll stand if it's all the same." The temperature in the room dropped several degrees. Two Kingsguard members shifted their weight. Cersei's expression didn't change, which itself was an expression. Joffrey's face moved through several emotions quickly: surprise, offense, the particular fury of someone unaccustomed to the experience of being declined, and settled on something that was trying to be menacing and landing somewhere closer to petulant. "You will kneel or I'll have your head." "Joffrey." Cersei's voice was quiet, which meant it was serious. The boy subsided, still radiating resentment, his eyes fixed on Steve with the focused animosity of someone filing information for later use. Cersei descended 2 steps and walked towards Steve with the unhurried movement of someone who had decided that the ground she walked on was hers by definition. She stopped at a conversational distance and looked at him directly. Not up and down, not the appraising survey she might give a potential asset, but directly, eyes to eyes. It the kind of look that was designed to find the center of a person. "You're not afraid," she said. "Should I be?" "Most people are." "Most people haven't fought things considerably scarier than a throne room," Steve said. He meant it without disrespect, and something in his tone communicated that accurately because Cersei's eyes sharpened slightly, recalibrating rather than offending. "What do you want?" she asked. It was the most direct thing she'd said, and therefore probably the most genuine. "The same thing I always want," Steve said, "for people to stop hurting people who can't defend themselves." Cersei studied him for a long moment. "That's either very simple or very complicated," she said. "Usually both," he agreed. She turned and walked toward a side door, gesturing for him to follow with the assumption rather than the request. The habit of someone who was always obeyed. Steve followed, partly because he was curious, and partly because declining would have ended the conversation without telling him what she actually wanted, which was the more valuable information. The room beyond was smaller, a solar with high windows and a table spread with maps. Real maps, Steve noted, detailed, annotated in multiple hands, showing troop dispositions and supply lines, and the movements of multiple armies across the continent. Cersei was a serious military thinker, whatever else she was. The maps told him that much. "Sit," she said, and this time it wasn't a command, it was an invitation, which was a significant distinction. He sat. She poured wine for both of them, which he didn't drink, and sat across from him with her hands folded on the table in a posture of deliberate openness that he recognized as performance without being insulted by it. Everyone performed. The question was what they were performing toward. "I'm going to be honest with you," she said, "because I think you're the kind of man who responds to honesty better than to flattery, and I don't have time to waste on approaches that won't work." "I appreciate that," Steve said, meaning it. "I want to hire you," she said. "Not as a soldier, not as a sword, as a She paused, selecting the word carefully. A problem solver. Someone who can move through situations that require both force and judgment. Name someone who isn't bound by the loyalties and debts that make every other capable person in this city unreliable. Steve looked at her across the map-covered table. He could see the shape of what she actually wanted very clearly. A weapon she could point, one that happened to come with its own moral authority, which would make it more effective and more deniable simultaneously. She wasn't wrong about his capabilities. She was wrong about his availability. "What would you have me do?" he asked, because the answer would tell him more than the offer. "There are threats to my son's reign that require addressing," she said. "Some of them are military, some are—" a slight pause. "Political. The distinction matters less than the result." "The result being?" "Stability," she said. "Peace. A kingdom that stops tearing itself apart." She held his gaze. "Those are things you want too." They were. She wasn't wrong, and the sophistication of the argument was that she was taking his actual values and reframing them as reasons to serve her, which was exactly the kind of thing he needed to be careful about. "Who defines stability?" he asked. "Who decides what peace looks like?" She smiled, a real one this time, surprised out of her by the precision of the question. "You're more careful than you look." "People keep underestimating that," Steve said. "I don't," she said, "which is why I'm asking rather than ordering." She leaned forward slightly. "The offer is genuine. You would have resources, protection, freedom of movement. Hey, and your—" she glanced at the shield, "unique capabilities would be applied toward ending this war faster than it would otherwise end. Fewer people die in a short war than a long one. That is simply mathematics." It was a good argument. It was the kind of argument that worked on people who genuinely cared about outcomes rather than process. Steve had encountered versions of it before, from people who had used it in good faith and people who had used it as a lever. He thought about the maps on the table, the troop dispositions, the supply lines, the specific location of Robb Stark's army, marked in a color that suggested threat rather than ally. "I'll think about it," he said, which was not a yes and not a no, and gave him time he needed. Cersei nodded as if this was the answer she'd expected and had already planned for. As he left the Solar, she called after him, her voice carrying the particular quality of someone delivering the real message after the meeting was technically over. "Lord Stark arrives in the city next week," she said. "I hope for his sake that he is as careful as you are." Steve paused in the doorway without turning around. The words arranged themselves in his mind with the cold clarity of a warning delivered as a threat, or possibly a threat delivered as a warning. He walked out of the Red Keep into the noise of King's Landing, with the specific, focused urgency of a man who had just watched a clock start counting and needed to move before it reached zero. Ned Stark arrived in King's Landing on a gray Tuesday morning with 100 Northern soldiers and the particular expression of a man who had already decided to do something difficult and was simply waiting for the moment to arrive. Steve met him at the city gate, which surprised Ned and told him something about how seriously Steve was taking whatever Cersei had implied in that solar doorway. They walked together through the crowded streets while Ned's household settled into the Tower of the Hand, and Steve delivered his assessment of the capital's political landscape with the directness of a military briefing. Varys, Baelish, Cersei, Joffrey, the specific dynamics of a small council that functioned less as a governing body and more as a collection of competing interests that occasionally produced policy as a byproduct. Ned listened the way he always listened, completely without interrupting, storing everything with the careful attention of a man who understood that information was the only armor that mattered in this particular environment. "Baelish will approach you first," Steve said. "He'll present himself as an old friend. He was once, apparently. Don't let that do the work he wants it to do." "You've met him?" Ned asked. "Yesterday." Steve kept his voice neutral. "He found me before I found him, which tells you something about his capabilities. He offered me information about a way home." Ned looked at him sharply. "Is it genuine?" "No," Steve said, "but he delivered it convincingly enough that I understand why it would work on someone who wanted it badly enough." He paused. "I want you to know that I know it isn't genuine. So if he tries to use me as a lever on you by suggesting I'm pursuing it, I'm not." Ned was quiet for a moment, navigating a narrow street where a merchant's cart had shed a wheel and created a bottleneck of frustrated foot traffic. Why are you telling me this? Because you deserve accurate information, Steve said, and because whatever you're about to discover in this city, you're going to need to trust someone who isn't operating an agenda. I'm not from here. I have no debts, no alliances, no inheritance to protect. What I tell you is what I actually think. Ned stopped walking. Around them, the city moved and pushed, indifferent. He looked at Steve with those gray eyes that saw more than they announced. Catelyn said to trust no one in King's Landing. Your wife is right, Steve said. Trust no one, including me, until I've earned it. Ned held his gaze for a long moment, then nodded. The same single nod Steve had received on the walls of Winterfell, carrying the same weight of genuine consideration rather than automatic agreement. What Ned found in the weeks that followed was worse than Steve had prepared him for, because the specifics were worse than the outline, and the outline had already been bad. The secret at the center of the Lannisters' succession was the kind of truth that, once known, couldn't be managed carefully. It could only be acted on or buried, and Ned Stark was constitutionally incapable of bearing it. Steve knew what he'd found the morning he came to the Tower of the Hand, and found Ned standing at the window looking out over the city, with the expression of a man holding something too heavy to carry and too dangerous to put down. Tell me, Steve said. Ned told him. Steve sat with it for a long moment. In his world, he had uncovered conspiracies of comparable scale. Hydra inside S.H.I.E.L.D., the systematic corruption of institutions he had believed in. And he recognized the specific nausea of discovering that the structure you thought you were operating inside was built on something rotten at its foundation. The difference was that in his world, he'd had Sam and Natasha and the resources of a global organization even after it was compromised. Ned had 100 Northern soldiers and a sense of honor that the city would treat as a vulnerability. You're going to confront her, Steve said. It wasn't a question. I have to, Ned said. The realm. I know, Steve said. I know you have to. I'm not arguing against it. He leaned forward. I'm arguing about how. Timing. Sequence. Who else knows before you move? These things matter more than the confrontation itself. Ned looked at him with the faintly surprised expression of a man who had expected opposition and received tactical support instead. You agree with what I'm doing. I agree with why you're doing it, Steve said carefully. I have concerns about the how and the when. There's a difference. He stood and moved to the window beside Ned, looking out at the red keep on its hill. In my experience, when you're about to challenge an entrenched power that controls the ground you're standing on, you need either overwhelming force, a secure exit, or allies who are already in position when you move. Right now, you have none of those things. I have the city watch, Ned said. Baelish has promised. Don't, Steve said, with a sharpness that he immediately moderated. I'm sorry, but don't. Baelish's promises are promissory notes written on someone else's account. He delivers on them exactly as long as delivery serves him. He turned to face Ned directly. Send a raven to Robb. Tonight. Tell him to move the Northern Army south. Not to King's Landing. That would look like invasion. To the neck. A position that can move quickly in any direction. Ned frowned. That could be seen as provocation. It could, Steve agreed. Or it could be seen as a Warden of the North repositioning forces for winter readiness, which is a completely ordinary thing that gives you military leverage without declaring intent. He paused. One raven. Tonight. Then we talk about the sequence of everything else. Ned considered it with the thoroughness he gave everything. Not slowness, Steve had learned, but genuine consideration, the habit of a man who made decisions he intended to live with. You've done this before, he said finally, navigated situations where the official structures were compromised. Once or twice, Steve said, with enough understatement that Ned almost smiled. What happened? Steve thought of the Triskelion, from one of 3 helicarriers and the Potomac, and a friend who'd been remade into something that didn't remember him and had to be pulled back piece by piece over years. Of institutions that had looked solid from the outside and were hollow at the center. We won, he said. It cost more than it should have because we moved too slowly at the beginning. He held Ned's gaze. I'd rather not repeat that. Ned nodded. He moved to his writing table and reached for parchment, and Steve felt something in the room shift, the particular quality of a decision being made by someone who meant it completely. The Raven was written and sent before nightfall. What neither of them knew was that Baelish had a man in the Tower of the Hand's rookery, that the Raven's departure was noted and reported before it had cleared the city walls, that Cersei received word of its contents within 2 hours through a channel that had nothing to do with Varys's little birds, because Cersei had her own network and had built it precisely for moments like this. The clock that Steve had felt start counting in the solar of the Red Keep accelerated. 3 days later, walking back to the Tower of the Hand through the Street of Steel in the early evening, Steve registered the shift in the ambient sound of the city, the way a soldier registered the moment before an ambush. Not a specific sound, but an absence of the normal ones. The particular silence that crowds made when something was about to happen, and everyone felt it before anyone announced it. He had the shield off his back and on his arm before the first gold cloak stepped out of the alley. There were 12 of them. City Watch, nominally gold cloaks, the symbol of King's Landing's municipal authority, which meant this was either official or designed to look official, and the distinction mattered enormously in terms of what it told him about how far things had already moved. The man leading them was not a city watchman. He was Sir Meryn Trant, Kingsguard, white cloak and dead eyes, a man whose reputation Steve had catalogued and found straightforwardly ugly. "The Queen requests your presence," Trant said. "The Queen can send a formal invitation," Steve said. "This isn't how you ask someone to a meeting." "It's not a request," Trant said, and drew his sword. Steve looked at the 12 men arranged across the street in the dying evening light. He assessed the geometry of the situation with the automatic tactical calculation of someone who had been doing this since before most of them were born, and felt the cold, clarifying focus that came over him when a situation stopped being political and became physical. 12 men, one Kingsguard, a narrow street with good cover on the left, and an open fish market on the right that would complicate movement, but provide improvised obstacles. The shield was already up. "Last chance," Steve said, meaning it genuinely. Trant attacked. The fight lasted 4 minutes. Steve knew the duration precisely because he'd developed the habit of timing engagements during the war. Not vanity, but data, the kind of operational information that told you things about your own performance and the enemy's capability that after-action reports couldn't capture. 4 minutes for 12 city watchmen and one Kingsguard in a narrow street, with no room to flank and no tactical coordination beyond the basic instinct to rush from multiple directions simultaneously. They were not bad soldiers. That was the honest assessment. They were trained, experienced, comfortable with violence, and operating with the confidence of men who had never faced anything that the standard applications of force couldn't handle. The problem was that Steve Rogers was not a standard application of any category they'd encountered, and by the time the first 3 men were down, the remainder had lost the psychological momentum that made group attacks effective. Trant was the last one standing and the most dangerous, because unlike the City Watch, he had genuine skill, economical footwork, efficient blade work, the kind of technique that came from serious training rather than brawling. He was also, Steve noted, completely comfortable with extreme violence in a way that went beyond professional necessity into something more personal, and that comfort made him predictable in the specific way that cruelty always made people predictable. Cruel fighters overcommitted to punishing blows. They left themselves open. Steve took the opening. Trant went down hard, conscious but comprehensively unable to continue, his sword arm locked in a joint control that would hold him immobile until someone came to help him up. Steve stood in the fish market end of the street, breathing steadily, 11 men groaning in various positions across the cobblestones, and felt the weight of what had just happened settle over him like a cold wave. This wasn't the Brotherhood's work anymore. This wasn't protecting villages from foraging soldiers. This was open conflict with the Crown's own forces in the middle of the capital city, and the consequences of that were political in ways that couldn't be undone by winning the fight. He had approximately 20 minutes before someone more senior than Tran arrived. He used them to get back to the Tower of the Hand. Ned was in his solar with 2 of his household knights and Jory Cassell, his captain of guard, going over documents with the focused intensity of a man building a legal case in a jurisdiction that had stopped caring about law. He looked up when Steve came through the door and read the situation immediately from Steve's face in the state of his cloak. "How many?" Jory asked. 12 watching Trant, Steve said. "Nobody's dead. Or that window is closing." Ned stood. "She moved faster than you expected." "Than I hoped," Steve corrected. "I expected it. I hoped I was wrong." He moved to the window and scanned the approaches to the tower, with the automatic habit of someone assessing defensive positions. "You need to move. Tonight. The tower isn't defensible against a serious force, and a serious force is what she'll send next." "I won't run," Ned said, with the quiet, total conviction of a man stating a fact about himself, rather than making a decision. Steve turned from the window. He had expected this, and had prepared for it the way you prepared for weather you couldn't change. Not by preventing it, but by planning around it. "I'm not asking you to run," he said carefully. "I'm asking you to reposition to ground where your honor means something. Here in this tower, you're a target. At the Sept of Baelor in public, with witnesses, you're a political statement. There's a difference." Ned considered this with the speed of a man whose thinking had been sharpened by weeks of navigating a city designed to confuse it. "You want me to make the accusation publicly. I want you to make it somewhere that making it publicly costs her more than staying quiet," Steve said. "Where the small folk hear it, where the lords in the city hear it, where there are witnesses she can't disappear." He paused. "The truth is your only weapon here. Use it where it has the most range." What happened next moved faster than either of them had planned for, because Baelish moved faster than either of them had accounted for. And the thing Steve had most feared about Peter Baelish, that his timing was better than everyone else's, because he'd been preparing his moves while others were still identifying the board, turned out to be entirely accurate. The city watch came to the Tower of the Hand in force 2 hours later. Not 12 men. 200 under Baelish's direct coordination, the command of the watch having shifted in the past 48 hours through a mechanism of debt and leverage that Varys would later explain to Steve, with the expression of a man describing a fire he tried to warn people about. Steve was on the tower's roof when they came, which gave him line of sight in the tactical high ground, and absolutely no good options that didn't involve leaving Ned without cover. He went down instead. So through the tower and out the front entrance into the courtyard where Ned's household guard were already engaged and already losing, the mathematics of 200 against 40 producing an inevitable conclusion that valor was accelerating rather than preventing. He hit the courtyard like a physical statement. The shield cleared a path through the press of gold cloaks with the efficiency of something that had been engineered specifically for exactly this kind of work. Crowd control in desperate circumstances. The dispersal of organized force through the precise application of kinetic energy, and the psychological impact of something moving through opposition that couldn't be stopped by standard means. Men went down and stayed down. Men got out of the way. The circle around Ned's remaining guards expanded. But there were 200 of them, and they kept coming. And Steve understood with the cold clarity of genuine tactical assessment that he could hold this courtyard for an extended period, but that holding it didn't solve the problem. It just deferred it. Every minute he held it, more watch arrived to replace the ones he'd put down. He fought his way to Ned's position in the courtyard center. Jory Cassell was down. Badly, Steve could see. The specific stillness of serious injury rather than death, but serious enough. 3 household knights still standing. Ned himself upright and sword drawn, fighting with the controlled competence of a man trained from childhood who had not forgotten any of it despite years behind a lord's desk. "We need an exit," Steve said, putting the shield between Ned and the nearest group of advancing watch. The stables," Ned said between controlled breaths. "North gate." They moved. Steve ran interference, the shield working as both weapon and barrier, creating corridors through the press that closed behind them, but stayed open long enough. Ned's remaining knights covered the flanks. The stable yard was chaos, horses panicked by the noise and press of men. But chaos was navigable if you moved with purpose rather than against it. They were 3 horses from clear when Baelish appeared. He came through the stable gate with a calm that was more frightening than aggression would have been, dressed plainly, hands visible, with the expression of a man who had arrived at a conclusion rather than a confrontation. Behind him, 8 men Steve didn't recognize. Not City Watch, not Lannister soldiers, something private and therefore more dangerous. "Hit Ned," Baelish said, with the specific warmth of an old friendship being deployed as a weapon. "I did try to warn you." Ned looked at him with something beyond anger, the expression of a man seeing a betrayal he had halfway expected and been hurt by anyway, because betrayals from people you'd known young always hurt regardless of preparedness. "Patter." Baelish's eyes moved to Steve with the careful attention of someone encountering a variable they'd modeled but not fully solved. "You're more difficult than anticipated," he said, with what sounded almost like genuine appreciation. "I'd factored in your capabilities. I hadn't fully accounted for your speed." "People keep making that mistake," Steve said. "They do," Baelish agreed. "The offer I made you?" "Still no," Steve said. Baelish smiled the smile of a man who had expected this and found it mildly inconvenient rather than conclusive. "Then we have a problem," he said, and nodded to his 8 men, who spread into positions that covered the stable gate and the yard's 2 other exits simultaneously with the practiced coordination of people who had drilled this specific scenario. Steve assessed the geometry. 8 professionals covering 3 exits. Ned with 2 functional knights. Himself with the shield and his own capabilities. Horses available if they could be mounted before the exits were fully controlled. It was solvable, barely, and with costs. Then Baelish said the thing that changed the calculation entirely. "Robb Stark's army," he said pleasantly, "is no longer at the neck. I'm afraid your raven was redirected. Honor the northern forces received rather different orders." He tilted his head slightly. "The help you were counting on isn't coming, Lord Stark, which means the question of what happens next is considerably more open than you'd like." The stable yard was very quiet for a moment, except for the nervous shifting of horses and the distant sound of the city going about its business, indifferent as always to the specific disasters occurring within it. Steve looked at Ned. Ned looked at Steve. Between them passed the particular communication of 2 people who had run out of good options and were now selecting among the bad ones, with the calm that comes when the situation has simplified itself down to its essential elements. "How do you want to do this?" Steve said quietly. Ned straightened, sheathed his sword, looked at Baelish with the gray eyes of a man who had decided that dignity was the only thing left that was entirely his. "Tell the Queen I'll hear what she has to say," he said, "under my own terms, in a public location, with Rogers present." Baelish considered this with the expression of a man running rapid calculations. "The Queen," he said finally, "will find those terms acceptable." A pause. She expected worse. "She should have," as Steve said. Baelish looked at him with something that might, in a different man, have been called respect. "Indeed," he said quietly, "she very much should have." The meeting was set for the Sept of Baelor at midday, which gave Steve the morning to prepare and Cersei the morning to consolidate. And both of them understood that the other was using the time exactly as they were using it themselves. The difference was that Cersei had the apparatus of the crown behind her preparation, and Steve had himself, Varys's last communication delivered through a street contact at dawn, and the particular focused clarity that came over him when a situation had narrowed to its irreducible essentials. Varys's message was brief. "The Queen intends to honor the location, but not the terms. The King's Guard will be present in numbers. Joffrey has been promised a spectacle. Whatever you intend, do it before the boy speaks. Once he speaks, she loses control of the outcome and controls the damage instead. That is the more dangerous phase." Steve read it twice, committed it to memory, and destroyed it. He spent an hour on the roof of a building adjacent to the Seps Plaza, mapping the approaches, and counting the positions where Kingsguard and City Watch were already deploying under the pretense of crowd management. There were more of them than the cover story required. There were also, he noted with carefully managed relief, more ordinary people, small folk, merchants, minor lords in the city on business, than he had expected. Word had moved through King's Landing the way word moved through any city where people were hungry for something to believe in. Fast, distorted, but directionally accurate. A man who fought the City Watch and couldn't be put down. A man who stood beside the Lord of Winterfell against the Crown's own forces. A man who didn't bend. They didn't know his name mostly. They called him the Shield Knight, which was reductive but not inaccurate. He found Ned at the base of the Sept steps with his two remaining knights, and the particular composure of a man who had made his peace with the fact that composure was the only thing he had left to offer the situation. Ned looked at Steve when he arrived and said nothing for a moment. Just looked. The way people looked when they were deciding what to say to someone they might not see again under good circumstances. "Whatever happens," Ned said finally, "I want you to know that you've conducted yourself with more honor than anyone I've met in this city, more than most people I've met anywhere." "Don't eulogize me yet," Steve said. "We're not done." "No," Ned agreed. "But I wanted to say it while there was time to say it properly." Steve looked at him. This man from a different world who had arrived at the same conclusions about what mattered through entirely different routes, who was about to walk into the most dangerous room of his life with nothing but the truth and the belief that the truth was enough, and felt the specific grief of someone who could see what was coming and couldn't fully prevent it and had to act anyway. "Stay close to me on the steps," Steve said. "Whatever she says, whatever Joffrey does, don't respond until I've assessed the room. Give me 3 seconds before you speak." He paused. 3 seconds is a long time. I can do a lot in 3 seconds. Ned nodded. They walked up the steps together. The Sept of Baelor was one of the largest structures in King's Landing. With its dome visible from most of the city, its steps broad enough to hold several hundred people comfortably. Cersei had arranged herself at the top of those steps with the precision of a director blocking a scene. Elevated, flanked by Kingsguard in their white cloaks, the setting sun behind her turning the dome's white stone gold. Joffrey stood slightly to her right with the restless energy of a boy who had been promised something and was impatient for it. The crowd below was larger than Steve had expected. Several hundred people in the plaza, more on the surrounding streets, the kind of audience that formed when something important was about to happen, and people could feel it without being told. Ned walked to the top of the steps and stood 10 feet from Cersei with Steve at his shoulder and his two knights flanking him. And for a moment the tableau held. Two powers facing each other on the steps of the city's greatest religious monument. The crowd below watching with the held-breath attention of people who understood that what happened next would matter. Cersei spoke first. "Lord Stark." Her voice was controlled, carrying to the crowd with the practiced projection of someone who had learned that in public moments, volume was authority. "You have made certain allegations. The Crown takes such matters seriously. We are here to address them openly as befits a just and transparent reign." It was masterfully done, Steve noted, framing the public confrontation as the Crown's initiative rather than Ned's. Positioning Joffrey's reign as the guarantor of transparency rather than the subject of accusation. She was good. She was genuinely very good. Ned stepped forward. "The allegations," he said, his northern cadence carrying clearly through the still air, "concern the succession. They concern the legitimacy of the reign. They concern—" Joffrey moved. Not an attack. Worse. He stepped forward with the particular energy of a boy who had decided that the situation had become boring and he was going to redirect it towards something more satisfying. And he spoke in the carrying, petulant voice of someone who had never learned that public words had consequences that private words didn't. "Enough," Joffrey said. "I don't want to hear his allegations. I want his head." The crowd reacted. A sound, not quite a gasp, more the collective intake of breath that preceded genuine shock. Several Kingsguard moved. Steve was already moving. He put himself between Ned and the advancing Kingsguard, with the shield up and his weight forward, and the specific physical communication of someone who was not going to move regardless of what was brought against him. The lead Kingsguard, Sir Boros Blount, heavy and experienced, stopped 2 feet from the shield's edge and assessed the situation with the professional caution of a man who had heard what happened in the tower courtyard and was not interested in a personal demonstration. "Don't," Steve said. One word, quiet, addressed to Blount but carrying to the whole top of the steps. Cersei's expression had fractured slightly. Joffrey's intervention had disrupted her sequencing, and she was managing the damage while simultaneously trying to recover control of a situation that had just become considerably less predictable. Steve could see her calculating, running options, determining which version of this she could still direct toward a useful outcome. He spoke to the crowd. He hadn't planned to. It wasn't in any version of the morning's preparation, but he looked down at several hundred people standing in the plaza below the steps. Small folk, merchants, people who had come because they'd heard about the Shield Knight and Eddard Stark and wanted to see whether the truth could survive contact with power. And he made the calculation that Varys had given him the information to make. Once Joffrey speaks, she controls the damage, unless someone else controlled the narrative first. "My name is Steve Rogers," he said loudly and clearly, addressing the crowd below rather than the figures beside him. "I'm not from this country. I have no house, no banner. I'm on no inheritance to protect. What I have is 3 months of watching what happens to the people of the Riverlands when power operates without accountability." He paused, letting the crowd's attention settle. Lord Stark came to this city to tell the truth about something important. He did that knowing it would cost him. That kind of courage deserves to be heard, not silenced by someone who's afraid of what the truth does to their position. The crowd was very quiet. The quality of its silence had changed, from spectator silence to witness silence. The difference between watching something happen and being present for something that mattered. Cersei recovered faster than most people would have. "Arrest them both," she said, her voice controlled. Amaya addressed to the Kingsguard with the flat authority of someone who had decided that the public dimension of the situation was now a loss to be minimized rather than a victory to be achieved. 6 Kingsguard moved simultaneously. What happened next was the most difficult 3 minutes of Steve's time in Westeros, because he was fighting people who were not villains. They were soldiers following orders from a legitimate authority as they understood it. Professional men doing their jobs, and the moral complexity of that sat in him like a stone, even as he moved through them with the efficiency the situation demanded. He put them down carefully, controlling the force of each engagement, keeping the shield between Ned and the worst of it, moving with the specific economy of someone who needed to win without killing, because killing here, in public on the steps of the Sept, would undo everything the crowd's silence had just built. 4 Kingsguard down, 2 remaining, reassessing. Joffrey was screaming something. Cersei had her hand on his arm and was managing him with the practiced efficiency of someone who had been doing it for 16 years. The crowd below had not dispersed. That was the thing Steve registered through the controlled chaos of the engagement. They were still there, several hundred people watching, and their presence was doing something to the soldiers on the steps, creating a visibility that changed the calculation of what could be done without consequence. Ned stepped forward into the space Steve had created and spoke again. Sui, his voice carrying over the noise with the particular authority of a man who had decided this was the hill and this was the moment. He spoke the truth clearly and completely, the whole of it, in front of several hundred witnesses on the steps of the Sept of Baelor, with the Shield Knight standing between him and the swords of the Kingsguard. When he finished, the plaza was silent enough to hear the wind off the bay. Cersei looked at Steve across the steps with an expression that had moved past anger into something more complex. A reassessment, the look of a strategist who had lost a particular engagement and was already thinking about the larger campaign. "You've made this considerably more complicated," she said, quietly enough that only he could hear it. "That was the idea," Steve said. "It won't be enough," she said. And then, with an honesty that surprised him, "I'm sorry it won't be enough. I think you might have been the most genuinely good person I've encountered in this city. That's not a compliment this city deserves to give." She turned and took Joffrey by the arm and walked back into the Sept with the composed movement of someone who had lost the battle and was determining what to sacrifice to win the war. The remaining Kingsguard followed. The City Watch held their positions but did not advance. Steve stood on the steps of the Sept of Baelor, with Ned Stark beside him and several hundred witnesses below them, and the truth spoken publicly into the open air of King's Landing, and felt the particular exhausted satisfaction of someone who had done the most they could do, and knew with cold certainty that the most they could do was not going to be enough. Because Cersei was right. It wasn't going to be enough. Not here, not in this city, not against this particular configuration of power, but it was on the record now. It was witnessed. And in Steve's experience, Witnessed truth had a way of surviving things that power was certain would kill it. He looked at Ned. "We need to move, now, before she regroups." Ned nodded. For the first time since Steve had known him, there was something in his expression beyond composure. Something that might have been relief. The specific relief of a man who had said what needed saying, regardless of what it cost, and could now face the cost without the burden of silence. They moved together down the steps into the crowd, which parted for them. And Steve felt the particular quality of several hundred people creating space not out of fear, but out of something older and more complicated. The instinct of ordinary people to make room for the ones who had just done something on their behalf that they couldn't do themselves. Behind them, the Sept of Baelor rose into the afternoon sky, its dome catching the light. Ahead, the streets of King's Landing waited, and somewhere in them, Cersei was already planning the next move. They made it 3 blocks before the city closed around them. Not soldiers, not immediately. Something more subtle and therefore more dangerous. The architecture of King's Landing itself, its narrow streets and sudden dead ends, and the way the city's geography had been built by centuries of organic growth rather than design. Creating a maze that favored people who knew it over people who were moving through it fast under pressure. Steve had mapped the routes from the Sept to the harbor and to the city's north gate during his morning reconnaissance. But mapping and moving were different things when the city watch was coordinating through channels he couldn't monitor, and the streets were filling with the particular agitated energy of a population that had witnessed something significant and hadn't yet decided what to do with the witnessing. Varys found them in an alley off the Street of Flower. He materialized from a doorway with the specific, unannounced quality of a man who had been in position before they arrived. Honey, which told Steve that Varys had anticipated their route with a precision that was either impressive or alarming depending on how you felt about being anticipated. He was carrying nothing, which meant he'd come to deliver information rather than provide materially, and his expression had shifted from the careful neutrality Steve had seen in the bathhouse to something more urgent underneath its controlled surface. "There's a ship," Varys said without preamble. "Bravosi merchant owes me a considerable favor. It leaves with the tide in 2 hours from a private dock at the harbor's eastern end." He looked at Ned. "Lord Stark, your daughters are in the city." Ned stopped moving. The effect was total and immediate. Every other consideration leaving his face to be replaced by the specific, focused alarm of a parent receiving information about their children's safety. "Where?" "Arya is currently unaccounted for," Varys said carefully. "She has been unaccounted for since this morning, which in her case I take as a sign of agency rather than capture. She is extraordinarily resourceful for an 11-year-old. A pause. "Sansa is in the Red Keep. She will be used. She is already being used as a reason why you will cooperate with whatever terms the Queen proposes." Ned looked at Steve. The calculation in his expression was painful to witness. A father and a lord, and a man of principle all pulling in different directions simultaneously. The terrible arithmetic of impossible choices. "We get Sansa first," Steve said. Then the ship." "The Red Keep," Varys said, with the tone of a man identifying a variable he had already determined was problematic. "I know," Steve said. "You cannot fight your way through the Red Keep," Varys said. "Not because of your capabilities, which I have revised upward considerably, but because the attempt would give Cersei exactly the justification she needs to move from political maneuvering to open military action. There are 6,000 Lannister soldiers within a day's ride of this city." Steve knew he was right. He filed it and kept moving through the calculation. "Is there another way in?" Varys looked at him for a moment with the expression of a man deciding how much of his infrastructure to reveal. Then with the particular sigh of someone making a decision they know is irreversible. "There are passages," he said. "Old ones. Built during the Mad King's reign for reasons I will not detail in an alley. I know them. I will take you." They moved through King's Landing in a configuration that felt nothing like the straightforward forward momentum Steve preferred. Layered, indirect, using Varys's knowledge of the city's underbelly with a fluency that confirmed everything Steve had suspected about the spider's true capabilities. Underground passages, servants' corridors, the specific geography of a city's hidden infrastructure, that only people who had spent decades operating in its shadows ever fully mapped. The Red Keep from the inside felt different than it had from the throne room. Smaller in some dimensions, a larger in others. The endless corridors and stairways of a structure that had been added to by successive inhabitants, each pursuing their own logic of expansion, creating a layered complexity that Varys navigated without hesitation, while Steve maintained the threat assessment of someone moving through hostile territory with reduced visibility and no reliable exit. They found Sansa in a room off the Queen's own chambers, not imprisoned exactly, but attended by two ladies who were not ladies, their posture and the specific quality of their attention, marking them as something considerably more capable than their appearance suggested. She was sitting at a window looking out over the city with the expression of a girl who had arrived in a story that had stopped resembling the story she'd been told and was trying to determine what that meant about everything she'd believed. She looked at Steve when he came through the door with the two ladies efficiently neutralized behind him, and her expression moved through fear and confusion and something that resolved into a very stark quality of assessment. Measuring, careful, deciding. "You're the Shield Knight," she said. "Steve," he said, "your father sent me. We need to move." She stood immediately, which told him everything he needed to know about Sansa Stark. She was frightened, and she was in a situation she hadn't chosen. But she was functional, and she would move when moving was what the situation required. She had more of her father in her than the city had had time to suppress. The extraction from the Red Keep took 40 minutes and used every skill Steve had developed across 3 months in Westeros and a lifetime of operating in hostile environments. There were 3 moments where the geometry of the situation narrowed to something that required precise, controlled violence. And each time Steve managed it with the economy of force that had become his signature in this world. People down, breathing, not dead, the moral ledger maintained at a cost that only he was fully tracking. They reached the harbor dock with 40 minutes to the tide. Ned was already there, having taken a separate route with Varys' guidance. He saw Sansa and his composure fractured completely for exactly 4 seconds. The specific, a total relief of a parent who has been operating in a sustained crisis and suddenly receives the one piece of information that allows them to feel it. And then he had his arms around his daughter, and his composure returned because the situation still required it, but differently now, with something underneath it that hadn't been there before. Arya found them on the dock. She came out of a coil of rope near the gangway where she had apparently been waiting for the past hour, having navigated her way from whatever part of the city she'd been operating in through means she declined to fully explain, and that Varys, when informed, received with an expression of genuine professional respect. She was dirty and armed with a pointed stick that she'd apparently used to some effect and completely, entirely herself. Furious and frightened and competent, and already planning her next move. Steve looked at her and thought of Mira at the graveside in Sherrick's Mill, the dry-eyed steadiness of a child who had decided to survive whatever the world brought. "Nice stick," he said. "It worked," Arya said, with complete stark directness. The ship was a broad-beam Bravosi merchantman called the Wind's Mercy, its captain a small, weathered woman named Teresa, who received the party of Starks and their companions with the professional equanimity of someone who had been transporting Varys' favors for long enough that unusual passengers had stopped being unusual. She looked at Steve's shield and suit once, said nothing about either, and directed them below decks with the efficiency of someone on a schedule. Steve stood at the gangway while the Starks boarded. Varys stood beside him, watching the harbor's eastern entrance, where the first suggestion of increased City Watch presence was becoming visible in the failing light. Word moving through the city's networks, the Queen's response beginning to organize itself. "You should board," Varys said. "I'm not going with them," Steve said. Varys was quiet for a moment. "I thought you might say that." "Ned's safe. The girls are safe." Steve watched the watch deployment tightening at the harbor entrance. "The city isn't. The people in it aren't. Whatever comes next, the war, whatever's underneath the war, someone needs to be here." "It will be extremely dangerous," Varys said with a dryness that acknowledged the understatement. "Usually is," Steve said. Ned came back down the gangway and stood beside Steve in the harbor's evening light, and the three of them looked at each other with the understanding of people who have been through something real together, and know that what comes next will separate them in ways that can't be predicted or prevented. Come with us, Ned said. You know I can't, Steve said. Ned looked at him for a long moment with those gray eyes. Then he reached to his belt and removed something, a small, worn disc of northern steel, a Stark token, the kind of thing a lord carried as a seal of recognition. He held it out to Steve. If you ever reach the north, he said, if you ever need the north, show this. Steve took it. It was warm from Ned's hand and heavier than its size suggested, the way things carried a long time always were. He closed his fingers around it and felt the specific weight of a promise made by a good man in a bad world. Take care of your daughters, Steve said. Take care of my city, Ned said. They clasped hands once, firmly in the way of soldiers who understood that some goodbyes were permanent regardless of intentions. And then Ned Stark walked back up the gangway, and the Wind's Mercy began the process of casting off. Steve watched the ship move into the harbor's darkening water until it cleared the eastern breakwater and caught the tide's pull, and began the long journey north toward safety, toward Robb's army, toward whatever future the Starks could build from the wreckage of this city's politics. He watched until the ship's lanterns were indistinguishable from the stars beginning to appear above the bay. Then he turned back toward King's Landing. The city rose above him in the evening dark. The red keep on its hill, the Sept's dome, the lights of 10,000 households going about their lives in the specific, persistent way that ordinary people went about their lives regardless of the catastrophes occurring in the layers of power above them. 200,000 people who planted nothing and owned nothing and were owed everything by a system that had decided they were the least important variable in every calculation. Somewhere in those streets, the Brotherhood's contacts were waiting. Somewhere, Varys's network was already processing the evening's events and determining next moves. Somewhere, Cersei was in the Red Keep planning the response that would make the Sept of Baelor's public moment as costly as possible for everyone who had participated in it. Somewhere north of the wall, something was moving that made all of this feel like a prelude. Steve felt the Stark token in his closed fist, warm steel from a good man's hand, and straightened his shoulders and walked back into King's Landing with the specific, quiet determination of someone who had never once in his long, strange life managed to walk away from a fight that needed fighting. He wasn't about to start now. The Sept of Baelor had witnessed the truth spoken aloud. The Wind's Mercy had carried the Starks toward safety, and Steve Rogers, a man displaced from everything he had ever known, stood alone in a medieval city that had no category for him, no framework for what he was, and no interest in providing either. He had arrived in Westeros with nothing but the shield on his back and the principles burned into him by a Brooklyn childhood and a government laboratory and 70 years of ice and everything that came after. He had left 200 small folks safer than he'd found them. He had stood beside the most honorable man in the Seven Kingdoms and made sure that honor was witnessed before the city swallowed it. He had put the truth on the record in front of several hundred people who would carry it with them for the rest of their lives. It wasn't enough. It was never enough. That was the thing Steve Rogers had learned across every world and every war he'd been dropped into. The work was never finished. The victory was never complete. The cost was always higher than the accounting suggested, but insufficient wasn't the same as meaningless. Westeros would not remember him in its histories. No master would record the Shield Knight's name with any accuracy. But in the Riverlands, in a village called Sherrick's Mill, a girl named Mira would grow up knowing that someone had come when it mattered, that someone had stopped. In the end, that was always where it started. The long night was coming, the dead were moving, and somewhere north of the wall, a war was building that made every throne in the South irrelevant. Steve Rogers had fought in worse odds. He walked north, live long and prosper. More stories await.